Right. Well, we're truly delighted to have George Packer with us here this evening. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with his past work as a journalist, novelist, and playwright. His 2005 book, The Assassin's Gate, remains a seminal study of how we got into the Iraq War and ensnared in a counterinsurgency campaign that our leaders failed to anticipate. George also is well known, of course, for his articles in The New Yorker, where he's been a staff writer for a decade, covering not only the war in Iraq, but atrocities in Sierra Leone, civil unrest in the Ivory Coast, and other adventuresome stories that no doubt keep his life insurance premiums high. George's new book, The Unwinding, is arguably his most ambitious yet. Actually, not arguably. He says it's his most ambitious yet. It's a history of sorts told through the tales of real people who over the past few decades have experienced the disintegration and disappearance of structures and norms that had defined American life. This unwinding has left many Americans adrift, struggling to survive, while others have profited enormously. It's hard to read this book and not be moved, provoked, enraged, at times entertained, at other times terribly saddened by the people profiled in it and the ways in which their stories reflect the recent seismic shifts in our politics and economics. Dwight Garner, in a New York Times review, called the book, quote, something close to a nonfiction masterpiece. And I, for one, had a hard time putting it down. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George Packer.
Thank you, Brad. I've been here many times. I want to recognize David Cohen, who's here tonight and who's brought me here along with his wife Carla in the past. And it's great to be here under the new leadership of Brad and Lissa. It is the best independent bookstore in the country. And And one of the great things about a book tour, and I've been on one for I think half my life now, it feels like running for office at times, is getting to visit independent bookstores around the country. They still exist. In fact, they seem stronger than the last time I did this, and that's a thrill, and it's thrilling to see so many people tonight. Thank you all for coming. So in a way, maybe this presence here tonight completely gainsays the entire theme of my book. That would be a wonderful way for us to conclude this evening. But I'll let you know what the book is about first, and then we can decide whether this event gives a lie to everything in The Unwinding. So Brad mentioned The Assassin's Gate, and it was in Iraq that I began to think about what became this book. Because while I watched that country implode and every American effort to rebuild what we had shattered fail, I went from thinking of it as a failure of American leaders, individual leaders. They're all still with us. They're all still writing books. Some of them are still on the bestseller list. To thinking about it more in terms of American institutions, which is an even less comforting thought. It seemed that across the board, every institution that was involved in Iraq, whether it was the military, the civilian parts of government, intelligence, the nonprofits, the media, the for-profits, every one of them failed, and failed in spite of considerable talent and money and effort. And one day I was with my friend Dexter Filkins, who was then with the New York Times and is now, I'm glad to say, with the New Yorker, in the green zone, watching two contractors saunter out of this cafe after eating their lunch of fried chicken sandwiches or hamburgers or whatever it was. And Dexter turned to me and just said, you know, we're just not that good anymore. And it had this chilling effect on me because I knew exactly what he meant. But I also wondered, how can that be? And when did it start? When did we start to not be that good anymore? And why? And those questions haunted me while I was in Iraq. even as the day-by-day violence held all of our attention. So I came home in 2008, and mainly because my insurance was unaffordable, so I needed to drop my premium. And just in time for the election and for the collapse of apparently every institution here at home, whether it was investment banks, commercial banks, auto manufacturers, all these old pillars of our economy and our society were just falling one after another. It felt like a fairly apocalyptic, historic moment. And it gave me the idea that I should write a book that tries to understand how it is that after seemingly thinking we were doing all right, we found out that we weren't doing all right at all. It's as if between the Iraq War and the financial crisis, we had a couple of stress tests applied to the body politic. And thinking we were in good shape, we had tried to do hard things like Iraq and found out we were not in good shape at all. In fact, we were very close to organ failure in a couple of cases. So how and why? Well, a lot of books have been written about the financial crisis. You've probably read some of them. A lot of books have been written about some of the other features of this institutional erosion that I'm talking about the decline of the middle class, about political polarization here in Washington and around the country. Books about income inequality, which has been a chronic and growing problem across the country. Books about the decline of traditional media and the rise of new media. I didn't really have anything to add to the policy debates and the 10 Things Wrong with America and 10 Ways to Fix It kind of books that are out there. Some of them quite good ones. What I wanted to do was instead to paint a big picture that was both a panoramic portrait of the country, but also a very intimate look at a handful of individuals who came from different backgrounds, from different parts of the country. Some of them obscure, you've never heard of them, and others quite famous. People from Newt Gingrich to Jay-Z. And also different regions of the country, from the centers of power like Washington, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, to some of the more forgotten places like the Rust Belt, Youngstown, Ohio in particular, like rural North Carolina, the Piedmont, tobacco and textile region of Carolina, like the Tampa Bay exurbs that got hit hard during the housing crisis. So I had this big idea of a book about America and how it came to be that our social contract came undone. That's what I mean by the unwinding over the past generation. And the only way I thought I could do it was not by trying to get my arms around such a vast subject in its entirety, which would have led to my own personal Iraq-like collapse, but instead something closer to a novel where you follow characters through their lives over the course of this generation. So I went out to try to find these people, and later on we can talk about how I found them and who they are and why I chose to write about them. But I'm just going to read a bit from the prologue, which will give you, it's like more like an overture. It'll give you a feel for the language of the book and also for the scope of it. No one can say when the unwinding began, when the coil that held Americans together in its secure and sometimes stifling grip first gave way. Like any great change, the unwinding began at countless times, in countless ways, and at some moment the country, always the same country, crossed a line of history and became irretrievably different. If you were born around 1960 or afterward, you've spent your adult life in the vertigo of that unwinding. You watched structures that had been in place before your birth collapse like pillars of salt across the vast visible landscape. the farms of the Carolina Piedmont, the factories of the Mahoning Valley, Florida subdivisions, California schools, and other things harder to see but no less vital in supporting the order of everyday life changed beyond recognition. Ways and means in Washington caucus rooms, taboos on New York trading desks, manners and morals everywhere. When the norms that made the old institutions useful began to unwind, and the leaders abandoned their posts, the Roosevelt Republic that had reigned for almost half a century came undone. The void was filled by the default force in American life, organized money. The unwinding is nothing new. There have been unwindings every generation or two. The fall to earth of the founders' heavenly republic in a noisy marketplace of quarrelsome factions. The war that tore the United States apart and turned them from plural to singular. The crash that laid waste to the business of America, making way for a democracy of bureaucrats and everymen. Each decline brought renewal. Each implosion released energy. Out of each unwinding came a new cohesion. The unwinding brings freedom, more than the world has ever granted, and to more kinds of people than ever before. Freedom to go away, freedom to return, freedom to change your story, get your facts, get hired, get fired, get high, marry, divorce, go broke, begin again, start a business, have it both ways, take it to the limit, walk away from the ruins, succeed beyond your dreams and boast about it, fail abjectly and try again. And with freedom, the unwinding brings its illusions, for all these pursuits are as fragile as thought balloons popping against circumstances. Winning and losing are all American games, and in the unwinding, winners win bigger than ever, floating away like bloated dirigibles, and losers have a long way to fall before they hit bottom, and sometimes they never do. This much freedom leaves you on your own. More Americans than ever before live alone, but even a family can exist in isolation, just managing to survive in the shadow of a huge military base without a soul to lend a hand. A shiny new community can spring up overnight, miles from anywhere, then fade away just as fast. An old city can lose its industrial foundation and 2/3 of its people, while all its mainstays, churches, government, businesses, charities, unions, fall like building flats in a strong wind, hardly making a sound. Alone on a landscape without solid structures, Americans have to improvise their own destinies, plot their own stories of success and salvation. A North Carolina boy, clutching a Bible in the sunlight, grows up to receive a new vision of how the countryside could be resurrected. A young man goes to Washington and spends the rest of his career trying to recall the idea that drew him there in the first place. An Ohio girl has to hold her life together as everything around her falls apart, until in middle age she finally seizes the chance to do more than survive. As these obscure Americans find their way in the unwinding, they pass alongside new monuments where the old institutions once stood, the outsized lives of our most famous countrymen, celebrities who only grow more exalted as other things recede. These icons sometimes occupy the personal place of household gods, and they offer themselves as answers to the riddle of how to live a good or better life. In the unwinding, everything changes and nothing lasts, except for the voices, American voices, open, sentimental, angry, matter of fact, inflected with borrowed ideas, God, TV, and the dimly remembered past, telling a joke above the noise of the assembly line, complaining behind window shades drawn against the world, thundering justice to a crowded park or an empty chamber, closing a deal on the phone, dreaming aloud late at night on a front porch as trucks rush by in the darkness. So that prologue gives you a map to the whole book. And it introduces all the main characters and all the main places. The Ohio girl is a black woman named Tammy Thomas who grew up in Youngstown. was the daughter of a heroin addict and took care of her mother more than her mother really ever took care of her. She told me once that when she was a little girl, her mother would smoke in bed, and she would try to keep herself awake long enough to wait until her mother had fallen asleep so she could take the cigarette out of her hand and put it out. Tammy had 3 children with no father around to support her, and managed to survive the complete collapse of this city, which began with the closing of the steel mills in 1978. The book begins more or less in 78, when a lot of things began to happen across the country that you see the early signs of trends that we're now so familiar with we don't even think about them. Deindustrialization is one of them. Tammy raised her kids by holding on to one of the last good factory jobs in Youngstown at a GM Auto Parts factory, and worked on the assembly line for 20 years until just before she was to get her pension in retirement. The company did what companies often do these days, declared bankruptcy, tore up its contracts, and sent the jobs to Mexico, and most of Tammy's pension disappeared with her job. So in the middle of her life, in the midst of this dying city, she had to remake herself completely. And that's a theme that keeps coming up with all the characters in the book. The need, as circumstances change and as disasters befall them one after another, to keep reinventing themselves. And Tammy became a community organizer just in time for the election of the first community organizer as president of the United States. The Washington guy is a career operative named Jeff Connaughton, who spent his entire career in this city. When he was 19, at the University of Alabama, he heard a young senator named Joe Biden give a speech. And he was so dazzled by Biden's speech and his eloquence, he thought, this is the next Kennedy. And Connaughton told Biden and himself, I will follow you to the White House. He was certain that that was Biden's destination. So for years, Connaughton worked for Biden, raised money for him, did all the things that all those unrecognized but essential people who are all over Washington called aides do, which is to say, made things happen and made the boss look good. We all focus on the Hamlets in Washington, but in a way, there's a more interesting story of the Rosencrantzes and the Guildensterns who attend them. And Jeff Connaughton was a Rosencrantz. Gradually, the relationship with his boss soured. Turned out that Biden was not such a nurturing boss after all. In fact, could be quite cruel. And Connaughton decided that public service was not what he had imagined it to be. And he did what many, many people in this city who work for the government do. He became a lobbyist. And he became an extremely successful lobbyist in the decade in which lobbying absolutely exploded in Washington, the past really 10 or 15 years. And he made a lot of money, and then he lost a lot of money in the financial crisis. And at that crucial moment in his life, and the financial crisis is a kind of watershed for all the characters in the book, for Jeff, for Tammy Thomas, and for others too. Their lives seem to be headed towards some reckoning, and it comes at that moment, and then the rest is a fallout from that. Connaughton decided to give government service one more try, and he came back into government as the chief of staff to the man who replaced Biden in the Senate when Biden became vice president, Ted Kaufman. And in a way, Kaufman and Connaughton were both freed up from the ever-present power of money in Washington because Kaufman wasn't going to run for re-election, and Connaughton had already made his money in the private sector. So they didn't do the K Street breakfast. They didn't raise the money. Instead, they went after Wall Street in this concerted effort to pass tough banking regulations and legislation that would have broken up the banks once they got past a certain size, and that would have gone some ways toward reinstating the Glass-Steagall law that had been repealed under Clinton. You all are Washingtonians. You know how this story ended. And for Jeff Connaughton, it ended with a sense of frustration and disappointment in Washington that goes beyond what most of us feel, because he'd given his whole life to politics and in a sense had become part of the problem and also part of the solution, and felt by the end that money was so powerful on Capitol Hill that it was almost impossible to resist it. And so he did something quite honorable. He blew himself up. He burned every bridge that he had in this city by telling his story and telling it quite candidly, both in his own autobiography and to me. And his story is one of the key parts of The Unwinding. And the third major character, I should mention also that there's places in the book that you keep returning to. Silicon Valley is one, represented mainly through the story of a guy named Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal, was a big outside investor in Facebook, and yet for all his success is quite a skeptic of Silicon Valley and of the internet. He thinks the internet is overhyped, that it has not done what a previous age of industry, the industrial age, did, which was to raise living standards across the board. Instead, Silicon Valley has made a few people very rich. It's created these very powerful companies. It's changed our lives and our lifestyles. It has not made for a healthy middle class. In fact, it's coincided with a period in which the middle class was falling. So that's something people in Silicon Valley have a very hard time explaining, and in fact, they don't even think about it very much, but Peter Thiel does. So I was interested in him, and he is the main character from Silicon Valley. But I should mention that one of the main characters, one of the two or three main characters, is a guy named Dean Price. He's the North Carolina boy you meet at the start in that prologue. He comes from the part of North Carolina that very, very old, traditional, very conservative. It's about as red America gets. In the Piedmont region around Greensboro and Winston-Salem. Tobacco and textiles had been the mainstay of that area for centuries, or at least for decades. And he grew up in a tobacco farming family and grew up where there was a certain security. If you graduated from his high school with a B, you got a job at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Warehouse in Winston-Salem. If you had a C average, you went into one of the textile mills. If you had an A average, you would go to one of the local colleges. But no matter what, there was a sort of a place for you. But Dean's father was a failed fire and brimstone preacher, had a series of churches, lost them all, was a very angry, bitter man, and ended up committing suicide. And Dean grew up in the shadow of that and was determined not to fall into the trap of failure thinking and poverty thinking, as he would put it, that his father had. And instead, he determined to become an entrepreneur. He opened a chain of truck stops and fast food restaurants on US 220 between Greensboro and Martinsville, Virginia. And for a little while, he was sort of living the life of an American entrepreneur. And then he began to feel the squeeze coming in from Walmart stores that were moving into Rockingham County, from Sheetz Oil, the national discount gas chain that was undercutting his price. And he felt, as he would put it, hogtied. He couldn't compete with the multinationals. And he had a series of epiphanies, culminating during Hurricane Katrina, when he realized that America was dependent on foreign oil and it was killing his business because he couldn't get diesel into the ground during that crisis. And the epiphany led him to this whole new vision, which was based on something quite humble: canola seeds, waste oil from local restaurants. In other words, ordinary stuff that was all around him in this ruined countryside of the Piedmont that could be used for biofuels and that could make him independent and could make the region independent and could bring the money back into the region that was leaving because of the big box stores and the multinationals. So I'm going to read one more passage that catches Dean just on the cusp of this epiphany, where he's watching his own business fail. He has not given up on the American dream. In fact, this man is a believer beyond anything you're likely to see in your lifetime. But he feels the pressure of the multinationals closing in on him, and he's just beginning to think that there must be another way. And maybe that other way is all around him in these fallow farms and fast food restaurants. A 2-lane asphalt road ran past the woods: white oak, shagbark hickory, Carolina ash. And in the shadows of the trees, a tobacco barn was year by year collapsing on itself, the metal roof sloping inward, pieces of bare siding hanging loose from nails. Nearby, a white clapboard house with empty windows squatted at the roadside, half smothered in tree branches and vines, while a fire-scorched, handwritten sign on the outside wall still advertised "Crush." Farther along, the road took a turn, and a tidy brick ranch house with a big satellite dish mounted on top stood in the golden sunlight of a red-brown field. Another bend, a gentle hill, deep woods again, and then an abandoned metal warehouse alone in a clearing. The road straightened and flattened and came to a stoplight where a pair of strip malls faced each other, parking lots full, a Walgreens across from a McDonald's, Shell opposing BP. Another light, a shuttered car dealership, a vast scrapyard with a mountain of twisted metal and stacked timbers next door to a spinning mill that was being methodically gutted like a great whale and sold off one part at a time. Then downtown, the lonely little Main Street, a taekwondo studio, a government benefits office, a closed restaurant, a nameless corner store for rent, 2 pedestrians in 4 blocks, a Dollar General that marked the far end of town. On the other side, the country opened up at once, the road passing fields, corn planted on one, nothing on the next, weeds and clods of dirt, and then a residential development with 2-story, look-alike houses in neat rows laid out across someone's former tobacco farm. And beyond the subdivision, isolated on acres of grass behind a split-rail fence and a man-made lake, the supersized faux chateau of a celebrity NASCAR driver. The landscape Dean had returned to, where he planned to live out his life, was very old and also new, as particular as anything in America, and also as generic, as beautiful and as ugly. In his imagination, it had become a nightmare so profoundly wrong that he called it sinful, and he hated the sin more than any casual visitor or distant critic possibly could. Yet he also saw here a dream of redemption so unlikely and glorious that it could only fill the mind's eye of a visionary native son. Once, driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hardshell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with him to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that his father had given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had. And the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Sometimes, some nights, he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness, like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayodan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. So that's Dean Price's nightmare vision of this beautiful Carolina countryside, and it really does take a native son to see it that thoroughly and that deeply. But he also saw in these fallow fields and these, shuttered towns where there'd once been textile mills, he saw a great renaissance. He imagined North Carolina would become, as he put it, the Silicon Valley of biofuels. And to this day, he is driving around the countryside of North Carolina, going from county to county and school board to school board, trying to convert, like some Johnny Appleseed, trying to convert his fellow North Carolinians to his vision, which is to have every school bus in North Carolina fueled by biodiesel that comes from the restaurants and fast food joints that are in every town and county in that state. The book does not end with 10 great ideas to bring America back to its greatness. It's not that kind of book, as you can tell from what I've been reading. It ends with Dean Price standing on his ancestral tobacco farm and dreaming of what his future might be if he ever makes his fortune in the biofuels business. And although there's something dark about the picture I've been painting of an America where those institutions that once supported middle-class aspirations no longer seem to work very well for middle-class people, and where so much of the wealth flows to the top and so much of our attention flows to the top, that you almost feel the celebrities in the book, who I haven't discussed too much, but maybe we can later, have taken the place of those institutions. But I think that it won't leave you depressed, because there are these Americans who are at the heart of it and who, far from having given up on the American dream, are completely invested in it, almost heartbreakingly, because you have to ask yourself if the American dream is still just as invested in them. So I'm going to leave it with those words, and now I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have.
I'm much older than you, so I can tell you exactly when it started, the unwinding. It started in 1968 with the election of Richard Nixon, after the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War demonstrations. And I think I know what caused it. But did these people, the various people that you interviewed, did they have any sense of what caused the problem and what needed to be done about it? But you don't want to put forward 10 ideas, but did they feel that something should be done, or did they just think that that's how things were and they were going to rise to the top the best they could in spite of it?
First, we shouldn't romanticize the past, because in the period before the book begins, Tammy Thomas would have been a completely disenfranchised American in Youngstown, Ohio, as both a Black American and as a woman. Peter Thiel, who happens to be gay, would not have been allowed to be a gay billionaire entrepreneur. He would have had to settle for being a billionaire entrepreneur with a private life of his own. So two things have happened at the same time. The country has grown more inclusive. Social equality has widened and widened, so that now, for the first time in my life, there will be gay Boy Scouts. And at the same time, those gay Boy Scouts will probably attend rather crappy public schools, because the economic gaps have widened. The place where you're born has more and more say over where you will end up than it ever did. Upward mobility, which used to be our justification for the rough form of capitalism that we have here, as opposed to Europe, where there's more equality but there's less mobility. No, not true anymore. Europe is now more mobile as a society than we are. So those two things have happened at the same time without necessarily being connected. I began the book by saying no one knows when it began, because everyone has their own moment when somehow the sense of, well, we're not quite held together any longer, began. The question is whether the characters in the book analyze it that way. Absolutely. Absolutely. And even Tammy, whose childhood was a nightmare, has a certain nostalgia, maybe we all do, for a time when Youngstown, you could smell the sulfur dioxide coming out of the steel mills. Well, we might well think, thank God that's no longer the case. what the better smelling air means is there's no jobs left in Youngstown. So to her, that was a smell of some stability and security. And Dean Price told me about how when you were a kid, you could screw up in any number of ways and still know that you were going to get a job in a textile mill, and that job would probably be enough to support you on a fairly modest life. Everyone feels on their own now. And as for solutions, believe me, they do not look to Washington. And they don't look to the centers of power. I think if there's a running theme among others that I've mentioned here, it's this complete lack of confidence in elites who used to seem to stand for something beyond their own interests and therefore had the authority that came with their privilege that allowed them to lead institutions.
The Unwinding has been compared to John Dos Passos' USA. And I wondered if that really is something you were conscious of. And second, whether what you were doing was searching for a new form of writing that would try to express the same kinds of things that Dos Passos did in USA.
Thanks for asking that. This book is a complete departure for me. If you know any of my previous books, one thing that will strike you is there's no first person in The Unwinding at all. I even tried to get rid of it in the acknowledgments, but that just didn't quite work. And the effect of that is for me as your guide, your explainer, your commenter, and occasionally, your autobiographer, to get out of the way so that what you hear are the characters. It's their story in the manner of a novel. If I were to start telling you what to think, as some of the reviewers who haven't loved the Dos Passos elements have asked for, it would be like the guy next to you at the movie starting to talk in the middle of the film. It would break the spell. It would remind you that you're at the movies. I don't want you to remember that you're reading a book. I want you to lose yourself in the book. So for that to happen, I'm out of the way. I mean, of course you feel my presence because there are certain biases and concerns and obsessions even that keep coming back. This book written by anyone else would be completely different. So Dos Passos is one of my literary heroes. He's almost forgotten today, or at least he's hardly read at all. But 60 or 70 years ago, he was up there with Hemingway and Fitzgerald. The reason I turned to him for help, and it was for help, is because I had this massive amount of material and I didn't have a structure for it. And that's a terrifying situation. I was really at the point where I had to write. I had a deadline and I did not know how this fit together. And usually I know well in advance, and there was panic. And then my wife reminded me, you did have an idea. It was to look at USA and to think about how the ordinary people, the celebrities, the collages and mashups of headlines and song lyrics got put together in a sort of kaleidoscopic narrative that kept moving forward, kept moving through history, but also moved around in a sort of jazzy way. And I said, yeah, but I didn't think I could pull that off. She said, well, you should try. So that became sort of it was a lifeline to try to pull it all together.
Hi. I'm 18 years old, so I may be one of the youngest people here, which means I also have a lot less life experience.
But a lot more life.
So I haven't lived through as many ups and downs in America as a lot of the other people have here, and I'm just wondering, what is your opinion on the future of America's political and economic state the next 20 to 30 years? Should I just move to Europe or something?
This is the question I hate. Could you ask me about Dos Passos? I'm going to actually just nakedly punt it, because I'm not here as a seer or a pundit or a prophet. And although I have my thoughts, and some of them are more dismal than others, they're really no more useful than anyone else's. I think we all sit at the bar and, have our complaints and our projections. And I don't see anything happening right now that suggests there's a magic solution to what the book is about. I don't think the internet, for example, which some people in Silicon Valley point to as like, this is the way society is going to organize itself in the future, peer networks, crowdsourcing. Government will work like Kickstarter. The sharing economy will take the place of all this regulation. I mean, I think there's a little bit of utopianism based on incredible success and incredible insularity out in Silicon Valley. So I'm not as much of a booster. I don't have a good answer. Washington worries me just about as much as any place. I mean, you feel this sense of heaviness and of stuckness when you're here. I've only been here a day. I've spent a lot of time here in the past. I feel, it's stuck. It is stuck. I was just talking with Tom Perriello, who's in the book, and who used to be a congressman in Virginia. And he said, well, we can't really do anything for a few years because of Congress. That's the people's body, and it's stuck. So I'm sorry, don't have a good answer.
Wondering when, but it is multifaceted, I guess. I'm wondering when you sort of personally began to get premonitions of the unwinding, how many years or decades ago, and when should we, body politic or whatever of the country, had a better sense of the unwinding. And most of all, I guess I'm interested in the role of sort of global changes in transglobalization or whatever you want on the unwinding, and whether just through basic demographics in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, or whatever, we could have foreseen this. And finally, the last facet, if you were going to do this same sort of book on people, individual stories from the developing world, from China, India, or wherever, would there be a different feel? Would the reader get a different feel about those folks than you give the reader in this book about Americans?
Yeah, this is an American story. It really is not a story you can transfer to the rising powers. This is about us. It's a very parochial, insular picture, but we're a very parochial, insular people. And if foreign policy is sort of just on the edges of it, but not really there, it's because the people I'm writing about don't particularly care about foreign policy. They care if our men and women are fighting somewhere. But that aside, and once that's over, world politics, globalization, only in as much as it has an immediate effect. So, globalization is a great, broad topic, and I'm afraid it's so hot in here that we might all fall asleep if I go on about it. All I'll say is there's one answer to my book, which is you're talking about this brief period in American history, which I call the Roosevelt Republic, from the 30s to the 70s, when we had this growing middle class and these structures and laws and institutions that were there to support it. And all that depended on our being the preeminent economy coming out of World War II and having this, this welfare state, this social contract between labor, business, and government. Once you had the doors thrown open to global competition, it was all over, and we were bound to end up the way we are now, one way or another. That's sort of the blind economic argument, that this is not about a social or even a personal failure. Right. Well, yes and no. Of course, those were incredibly important factors at the start, which is why the book begins in the 70s when global competition began to erode wages and job security in America. But if you look at Germany, which is subject to the exact same forces that we are, they've made decisions, policies, that have protected manufacturing and kept it in Germany because the government, the people understood manufacturing has to be the basis for some kind of middle-class society. And they have kept middle-class lifestyles from being completely eroded by these economic forces that are constantly at work. Job security is much greater in Germany. When the recession hit Germany, they decided to have everybody work half a week in certain industries in order to have many fewer people unemployed. So it's a long way of saying, yes, globalization is huge, but I am not an economist in the sense of seeing everything in terms of those. We have made decisions about taxes, about industries, and even norms, what people at the top are willing to do and not do. Once you get rid of a taboo, like the taboo against, in 40 or 50 years ago, you didn't see CEOs firing 20% of the workforce and then getting a big payoff from their board. Today, it's routine in every industry, including mine, because it's done now, because the taboo is gone, not because of any economic imperative, just that it's doable, it's thinkable. What is thinkable? That's changed a lot over the last 40 years. So that's why I'm a little skeptical that, that this would have happened no matter what, and that the same thing that's happening elsewhere is happening.
Hi. So my question for you is whether or not you feel there are any fiction writers writing right now that have their finger on the pulse of the unraveling and what you're describing.
That's a great question.
And if so, who they are and why.
I like that question. I think Jonathan Franzen does. His subject is the middle class, which is a great subject. It's kind of the subject of the novel since the 19th century, and he's updated it to the American 21st century in a really imaginative way. He isn't writing about people at either end of the economic scale, but has a feel for the things that are is it centripetal that goes outward? The forces that are pulling people apart and how little there is to hold them together. So I would start with Franzen. Yes.
I've noticed a psychological aspect. It's taken me quite a while to put this together in my mind, but what it amounts to in American society right now is passive aggressiveness as the answer to a lot of, not all the people you're talking about that were thrown under the bus, but the middle class. And in my line of work, it has affected a lot of things. You can't get a building permit nowadays without a great deal of difficulty. You have this sort of fourth wing of government that writes all sorts of rules. They just make them up. It's not legislation or anything. And I swear to you that a great architect I knew years ago could do with 6 people what it would now take 20 people to do just to help get a permit for the developer or whoever it is, because you have the people in government with their pages of regulations and everything else that happens. Really, in effect, it's this. I think the middle class has basically become a society of tarantulas.
Well, I was with you until the tarantulas.
Well, that's a term that Tom Wolfe uses for a certain type of individual that can't get you this way, but he will sting you another way.
Well, you know what you're saying about regulations and permits rings true. Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley character, who's a libertarian and who has a very different point of view from my own and from some of the others in the book, but it's a point of view you really do have to grapple with. He said to me, the Golden Gate Bridge was built in just a couple of years. And right outside his grand office window in San Francisco's Marina District, he's been watching an on-ramp to the Golden Gate Bridge take about 8 years. So that is sort of what
exactly what I'm talking
about.
But
here's where I'm going to depart from you. I don't like generalizations that say we are all this way or we are all that way. The reason why this book is structured like a novel and takes you deep into these people's lives is because those generalizations always have some truth, and then they always kind of leave you dissatisfied because they don't take you into the essential truths. Whereas what my book might not have in generalizing power, I think it does have in the power of these people's stories to tell you what it's like for some people to be living in America today. And that's a trade-off that I was willing to make.